The private jet touches down on the tarmac at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. A tall black man in a tailored suit steps out, phone pressed to his ear. His face is ice cold. Inside Terminal 3, a flight attendant is frozen in place, realizing too late that the 12-year-old girl she just humiliated is about to change her entire life. The intercom crackles overhead with an emergency announcement. Before we dive into what happened, let me know in the comments where you're watching from right now. If this story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe because what unfolds next will restore your faith in justice. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of how this situation transforms from a nightmare into the most satisfying turnaround you've ever witnessed. The morning started like any other busy Thursday at Denver International Airport. Gate C-47 buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy as passengers lined up for the 9:30 departure to Los Angeles. Among them stood a 12-year-old black girl, her designer backpack slung over one shoulder, boarding pass clutched carefully in her hand. She wore a cream-colored sweater and dark jeans, her hair pulled back in neat braids. Everything about her suggested a child who had been taught to present herself well, to follow rules, to respect authority. When she reached the gate agent, she handed over her boarding pass with a polite smile. The scanner beeped green. Seat 2A. First class. The agent barely glanced at her as she waved her through, already focused on the next passenger in line. The girl walked down the jetway with the quiet confidence of someone who had flown this route before, who knew exactly where she was going and why. The aircraft itself gleamed under the terminal lights, one of the airline's newer models with the upgraded cabins and larger overhead bins. She turned left into first class, immediately enveloped by the distinct atmosphere that separated this section from the rest of the plane. Leather seats in navy blue. Extra legroom that seemed almost excessive. The hushed tones of travelers who paid premium prices for premium comfort. She found her seat by the window, stowed her backpack in the overhead compartment with a slight stretch, and settled in with the practiced ease of a seasoned traveler. Around her, other first-class passengers filed in. A businessman in his 50s took seat 4D, immediately pulling out his laptop. An elderly couple shuffled slowly to seats 3A and 3B, the wife fussing with too many carry-on items. And then came the woman who would change everything. Middle-aged, blonde hair styled in that particular way that suggested regular salon appointments, wearing what was clearly expensive athleisure wear and carrying a leather tote that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She stopped at row 2, checked her boarding pass twice, and looked at the girl sitting in 2A with an expression that started as confusion and quickly morphed into something else entirely. The woman took her seat in 2B with exaggerated movements, making it clear through body language alone that she was displeased. Her husband, a balding man with rimless glasses, sat across the aisle in 2C. They exchanged a look, one of those wordless married couple communications that conveyed volumes. The girl noticed but said nothing, pulling out a book from her backpack and opening it to a marked page. She also had an iPad, which she placed on the empty middle seat between herself and the woman, creating a small barrier of personal space. The woman glanced over repeatedly as more passengers boarded. Each glance lasted a little longer. She leaned across the aisle to whisper something to her husband, who looked over as well, his eyebrows raised. The girl kept her eyes on her book, but her shoulders had tensed almost imperceptibly. She knew she was being watched. She knew what those looks meant. At 12 years old, she already knew. A flight attendant appeared, doing the standard pre-departure checks. She was white, somewhere in her 30s, with her dark hair pulled back in the regulation bun and a smile that seemed painted on from years of customer service training. Her name badge read, Jennifer. She moved through the cabin efficiently, checking overhead bins, offering to hang coats, making small talk with passengers who seemed receptive. When she reached row 2, her eyes landed on the girl and something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. Or doubt. Are you sure you're in the right section, sweetie? Jennifer's voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of tone adults use when they're trying to sound caring but are actually questioning you. The girl looked up from her book, meeting the attendant's eyes with a level gaze that betrayed none of the anxiety beginning to coil in her stomach. "Yes, ma'am. This is my seat. 2A. She held up her boarding pass, the one that had already been scanned at the gate, the one that clearly showed her seat assignment in first class. Jennifer took the boarding pass, examined it more closely than seemed necessary, turned it over as if expecting to find some disclaimer on the back. "Okay, honey. Just making sure. Sometimes the system makes mistakes." She handed it back but didn't move away. Instead, she pulled out her tablet, the one flight attendants used for the passenger manifest, and began scrolling through it with a frown deepening on her face. The woman in 2B watched this interaction with obvious interest. Other passengers were starting to notice too. The businessman in 4D glanced up from his laptop. The elderly wife in 3B craned her neck to see what was happening. The girl felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure, pushing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe normally. She forced herself to remain calm, to keep her expression neutral, to not give anyone a reason to think she was being difficult or defensive. Jennifer checked her tablet twice more, scrolling up and down the passenger list as if hoping the information would change if she looked at it enough times. Finally, she seemed to make a decision. Without another word to the girl, she turned and walked quickly toward the front of the plane, disappearing through the cockpit door. The girl watched her go, a sinking feeling beginning in her stomach. She had done nothing wrong. Her ticket was valid. Her father had booked this seat specifically, had made sure everything was correct. So why did it feel like she was about to be in trouble? The woman in 2B smiled, a small satisfied curve of her lips. She settled back into her seat and pulled out a magazine, but her body language radiated vindication. She had raised a concern, even if only through pointed looks and whispered comments. Now someone was doing something about it. The girl turned back to her book, but the words swam on the page. She wasn't reading anymore. She was waiting. Jennifer returned 3 minutes later, but she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a man in his 40s wearing the more elaborate uniform that marked him as senior crew. His badge identified him as Brian, and he carried himself with the authority of someone used to making final decisions. They approached row 2 together, and the girl felt every eye in first class turn toward her. This was no longer a quiet check. This was becoming a scene. "Good morning, miss," Brian said, his voice loud enough that it carried through the entire cabin. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again, please." It wasn't a request despite the polite phrasing. The girl handed it over wordlessly, her hands steady even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. Brian examined it with the same excessive scrutiny Jennifer had used, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgeries, comparing the information on it against something on Jennifer's tablet. "This says you're traveling alone?" he asked, looking at her over the top of the boarding pass. "Yes, sir. I'm going to Los Angeles to visit my father." "And how old are you?" 12. She knew where this was going. She had been briefed by her father about traveling alone, about the unaccompanied minor procedures, about everything that was supposed to happen. This wasn't part of it. "Your father purchased this ticket for you?" Brian's tone had shifted, becoming slightly more skeptical. "Yes, sir." She could feel the woman in 2B listening intently, practically leaning toward them to catch every word. "What does your father do?" The question came out casual, conversational, but it carried an undertone that made it feel like an interrogation. Like her answer would determine whether she deserved to be sitting in this seat. The girl hesitated. Her father had taught her not to brag, not to throw around his name or his position like it was a shield. He wanted her to move through the world on her own merits, to be judged for who she was rather than who he was. But sitting here now, with a senior crew member questioning her right to occupy a seat her father had legally purchased, she wondered if maybe this was the time to say exactly who her father was. Before she could decide, the woman in 2B made the decision for her. "Excuse me," the woman interjected, her voice sharp with indignation. "I paid $1,500 for this seat. I shouldn't have to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong here. If there's been some kind of mix-up with the booking system, surely it would be more appropriate for her to sit in economy where she'd be more comfortable." The last two words dripped with false concern, the kind of coded language that allowed prejudice to hide behind politeness. A murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. Some passengers nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The businessman in 4D had stopped even pretending to work on his laptop. This was better entertainment than whatever emails he had been answering. The elderly couple whispered to each other urgently. Brian straightened up, clearly emboldened by having a paying customer voice what he had been thinking. "Miss, I think it might be best if we relocate you to a different seat. We have some lovely options in our Economy Plus section that would be perfect for someone your age. More families back there, you know. Kids to talk to." "I don't want to move," the girl said quietly but firmly. "My father booked this seat for me specifically. I have a right to be here." "Well, there seems to be some confusion about the booking. Maybe there was a system error. These things happen. We just need to verify with your father that this ticket is correct." Jennifer jumped in, trying to sound reasonable. "If you could just give us his phone number, we can call him and clear this whole thing up." The girl shook her head. "He's in an important meeting. He can't be disturbed right now." "Then I'm sure he won't mind if we make a quick call to verify. We're just trying to follow procedure here." Brian's patience was wearing thin. The girl could hear it in his voice, see it in the way his jaw tightened. "I'm not giving you his number. You don't need to verify anything. My ticket is valid." The gate agent scanned it. "Everything is fine." The girl's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. She was 12 years old, but she was not going to be bullied out of a seat she had every right to occupy. The woman in 2B let out an exasperated sigh. "This is absolutely ridiculous. We're going to miss our departure time because of this nonsense. Someone needs to take charge of this situation." "Ma'am, I assure you we're handling it," Brian said to the woman with an apologetic smile before turning back to the girl with a much harder expression. "Young lady, I'm going to give you one more chance to cooperate. Either you provide us with contact information so we can verify this ticket, or you voluntarily relocate to another seat. If you refuse to do either, I'll have no choice but to call security. Do you understand?" The girl understood perfectly. She understood that no matter what she said, no matter how valid her ticket was, these people had already decided she didn't belong in first class. They had looked at her skin color and made assumptions about what she could afford, where she should sit, what kind of family she came from. They had decided, and now they were looking for any excuse to justify that decision. Her hands were shaking now, but she kept them clasped tightly in her lap where no one could see. "I'm not moving. This is my seat." Brian's expression hardened completely. He straightened up and pulled out his radio. "We need security at gate C47 immediately." His voice carried through the cabin, officializing the situation, making it clear that this was now a matter for authorities. The girl felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes but refused to let them fall. She would not cry in front of these people. She would not give them the satisfaction. The whispers in first class grew louder. Several passengers had their phones out now, recording the scene. This was the kind of drama that would definitely end up on social media later. The elderly woman in 3B actually looked sympathetic, leaning toward her husband and saying something that sounded like, "This isn't right," but she didn't speak up loud enough for anyone else to hear. The businessman in 4D had his phone out too, angled toward row 2. Two airport security officers appeared at the front of the plane within 90 seconds. One was white, stocky, with the bearing of someone who had been in law enforcement for decades. The other was black, younger, with sharp eyes that immediately took in the scene with what looked like weary recognition. The security officers walked down the aisle slowly, their presence transforming the atmosphere from tense to something heavier. Every passenger in first class was watching now, no longer even pretending to mind their own business. This was a spectacle, and everyone wanted to see how it would end. The girl sat very still in her seat, hands now gripping the armrests, trying to control the trembling that threatened to take over her entire body. "What seems to be the problem here?" the white officer asked, directing his question to Brian rather than to the girl. Brian immediately launched into his explanation, his voice taking on the practiced tone of someone who knew how to make himself sound reasonable and professional. "We have a discrepancy with this young lady's ticket. She's traveling alone, claims her father purchased a first-class seat for her, but she's refusing to provide contact information so we can verify the booking. When we suggested she might be more comfortable in a different section, she became uncooperative." The girl opened her mouth to protest the characterization, but the white officer held up his hand, silencing her before she could speak. "Let me see your boarding pass and ID." She handed them over with shaking fingers. He examined both carefully, then handed them to his partner, the black officer, who looked at them with equal attention. "This boarding pass looks completely legitimate to me," the black officer said carefully, his eyes moving from the documents to the girl's face. There was something in his expression, a gentleness that hadn't been present in any of the other adults who had questioned her. "The seat assignment matches her ticket. It was scanned at the gate. I'm not seeing any discrepancy. Company policy gives us the right to refuse service if we feel there's any irregularity," Jennifer interjected quickly, stepping forward. "We're within our rights to verify passenger information, especially for unaccompanied minors in premium cabins." "That's not what this is about," the girl said, her voice cracking slightly. Tears were streaming down her face now, hot and humiliating. She couldn't hold them back anymore. "You're doing this because I'm black. Because you don't think someone who looks like me belongs in first class. My ticket is real. My father bought it. I didn't do anything wrong." The white officer's expression didn't change, but the black officer's jaw tightened. He turned to Brian with barely concealed frustration. "Sir, if her ticket is valid and she hasn't caused any disturbance, I'm not sure what you want us to do here." The woman in 2B, apparently sensing that the situation might not resolve in her favor, raised her voice again. "This is outrageous. We've been sitting here for 20 minutes now. Just remove her so we can depart. I have a connection to make in Los Angeles. Other people have places to be. This is disrupting everyone's travel plans." Other passengers joined in, a chorus of complaints about departure delays, missed connections, the inconvenience of it all. Not one person spoke up in the girl's defense. Not one person questioned whether removing her was the right thing to do. The businessman in 4D actually said, "Can we please just resolve this? Some of us have important meetings." Brian seemed to take strength from the passenger support. "As you can hear, this situation is now affecting other customers and delaying our departure. Company policy allows us to remove passengers who are disruptive or who cause delays. She's had multiple opportunities to cooperate and has refused each time. We need her off this aircraft so we can proceed with our scheduled departure." "I'm not being disruptive," the girl cried out, her composure finally breaking completely. "I'm sitting quietly in my assigned seat. Please, just let me call my father. He can explain everything. Please." "You've already refused to provide contact information," Jennifer said with fake sympathy. "It's too late for that now." The black security officer looked torn, his eyes moving between the sobbing child and the crew members who clearly just wanted her gone. "Let's just let her make a call. This could all be cleared up in 2 minutes." His partner shook his head, deferring to the airline staff, maintaining that professional distance that allowed injustice to proceed unchallenged when it was technically legal. "The decision has been made," Brian said with finality. "She needs to deplane. Now." If she refuses, we'll note her as an uncooperative passenger, which will affect her ability to fly with us in the future. It was a threat barely disguised as information. The girl looked around the cabin one last time, hoping someone, anyone, would speak up. Would say this was wrong. Would refuse to let this happen. But every face that met hers looked away. They were uncomfortable, maybe, but not uncomfortable enough to act. Certainly not uncomfortable enough to delay their own travels. The elderly woman in 3B had tears in her own eyes, but her husband held her hand tightly, keeping her silent. With shaking hands, the girl gathered her belongings. Her book, her iPad, her backpack from the overhead bin that the black security officer retrieved for her. She walked down the aisle with tears streaming down her face, past row after row of passengers who watched her public humiliation as if it were entertainment. As she passed row 5, an elderly white woman actually applauded slowly, 3 sharp claps that echoed through the cabin like gunshots. The girl flinched at the sound but kept walking. The security officers flanked her as she exited the aircraft, a 12-year-old child being escorted out like a criminal. As they walked up the jetway, her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She tried to reach for it, but the white security officer said, "No phones until we get to the office." Even that small comfort was denied to her. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the plane preparing for departure. Closing overhead bins. The captain's voice over the intercom apologizing for the brief delay. As if she had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. As if her humiliation was just a hiccup in everyone else's important day. The airport security office was a small, windowless room with fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly green. There was a desk, a few chairs, posters on the wall about prohibited items and security protocols. The girl sat in one of the chairs, her backpack on her lap like a shield, tears still flowing although she had stopped making any sound. Silent crying, the kind that came from deep hurt rather than dramatic upset. The black security officer, whose name tag read, Officer Morrison, brought her a bottle of water and a small packet of tissues. His partner had disappeared to file paperwork, leaving them alone. Morrison pulled a chair over and sat down across from her, his expression kind but professional. "Are you okay?" It was a stupid question with an obvious answer, but sometimes people needed to be asked anyway. She shook her head, unable to speak. Her throat felt tight, closed up with emotion and injustice. Morrison waited patiently, not pushing her, just sitting there as a steady presence. After a long moment, he said gently, "Would you like to call someone now? Your father, maybe?" The girl nodded and pulled out her phone with trembling hands. The screen lit up with notification after notification. 17 missed calls. All from Dad. Her heart sank even further. He had been trying to reach her, probably wondering why she wasn't answering, maybe worried something had happened. He had no idea how right he was to worry. With shaking fingers, she called him back. He answered before the first ring finished. "Where are you?" His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Why aren't you on the plane? I've been calling you for 30 minutes. What happened?" The sound of her father's voice broke something in her. All the composure she had tried to maintain, all the strength she had forced herself to show in front of those people who didn't believe she belonged, crumbled completely. She sobbed into the phone, words tumbling out in broken fragments. The flight attendant. The accusations. The other passenger complaining. Being questioned in front of everyone. Security. Being removed from the plane. The applause. She told him everything, the words punctuated by hiccuping breaths and fresh tears. On the other end of the line, silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of a fury so intense it had frozen everything in its path. When her father finally spoke again, his voice had changed completely. It was quiet now, dangerously quiet, each word precisely articulated. "Which airline? Give me the exact name. What flight number? Say that again slowly." She provided every detail she could remember through her tears. Flight 447. Gate C-47. Jennifer the flight attendant. Brian the senior crew member. The passenger in seat 2B who had complained, whose name she didn't know but could describe perfectly. The white officer who hadn't believed her. The black officer, Morrison, who had tried to help. She gave her father everything, dates and times and names from badges and seat assignments, every piece of information that might matter. Baby girl, listen to me very carefully. Her father's voice was still that cold, controlled tone that was somehow more frightening than yelling. Stay exactly where you are. Don't move from that office. Don't speak to anyone else without Officer Morrison present. Do you understand me? She mumbled agreement through her tears. I'm handling this. That plane isn't going anywhere. Those people aren't going anywhere. I promise you, everything is about to change. But Dad, they already left. The plane took off. I missed the flight. No, sweetheart. That plane hasn't taken off. And it's not going to. Not until I get there. I'm already in the air. I'll be there in 20 minutes. There was something in his voice, a certainty that made no sense given the circumstances, but she had learned to trust that tone. It was the voice he used when he was about to make something happen that seemed impossible. The call ended. The girl sat holding her phone, staring at the blank screen, trying to understand what her father had meant. How could he stop a plane that had already departed? How was he already in the air? Where had he been coming from? Nothing made sense, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. Officer Morrison had been listening carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful with each passing moment. Can I ask you something? He said carefully. What's your last name? She told him. Said the name clearly, the name that was on her boarding pass, the name that no one had apparently bothered to actually process or consider significant. Morrison's eyes widened. He sat back in his chair as if physically pushed by the revelation. Your father is. He didn't even finish the sentence, just stared at her with dawning horror and understanding. Before she could confirm, his radio crackled to life with urgent chatter. All units, we have a priority arrival at the executive terminal. Implementing Code Silver protocols immediately. This is not a drill. Priority arrival inbound, ETA 15 minutes. Code Silver was reserved for VIPs, for corporate executives and government officials, for people important enough that entire airport procedure shifted to accommodate them. Morrison looked at the girl, then at his radio, then back at the girl. Pieces were clearly falling into place in his mind, connections being made that explained so much about the last hour. Does your father? He started, then stopped, recalibrated his question. What exactly does your father do for work? Before she could answer, another announcement echoed through the office, this one over the airport's public address system. The voice was clipped, professional, urgent. Flight 447 to Los Angeles, return to gate immediately. All passengers remain seated. This is a mandatory gate return. Crew members report to the gate supervisor immediately upon arrival. This is not a request. The girl looked up at Officer Morrison with wide eyes. He said the plane wouldn't take off. Morrison was already standing, his entire demeanor shifted into high alert mode. Miss, I think we need to get you to a more private location. Somewhere your father can meet you when he arrives. Somewhere away from. He gestured vaguely, but she understood. Away from the people who had done this to her. Away from the crowd that was about to gather when word spread about whatever was happening. She nodded and stood, shouldering her backpack, wiping her face with the tissues he had given her. As they walked through the terminal toward the executive lounge area, she noticed the shift in energy. Airport staff were moving with increased urgency. Supervisors were speaking into radios and headsets. Something big was happening, something that was rippling through the entire airport's normal operations. And somehow, impossibly, it was connected to her. Now, I need you to comment number 1 if you think what happened to this girl was absolutely unacceptable, or comment number 2 if you think the airline staff were just following procedures. Hit that like button if you believe standing up against injustice matters, and make sure you're subscribed because what comes next is going to shock you. Her father isn't just any concerned parent. He's someone with the power to make everyone involved wish they had made very different choices. So what do you think happens when that plane returns to the gate? Drop your predictions in the comments right now. Back on Flight 447, confusion spread through the cabin like a contagion. The plane had been taxiing toward the runway, passengers settled in for departure, when the captain's voice had crackled over the intercom with the announcement no one expected. Gate return. Mandatory. No explanation provided beyond those terse sentences that left everyone bewildered and increasingly irritated. What is happening? The woman in 2B demanded of anyone who would listen. We were about to take off. I'm going to miss my connection now. This is completely unacceptable. Her husband made sympathetic noises but looked equally frustrated, checking his watch repeatedly as if that would somehow speed things along. Jennifer and Brian stood near the galley, speaking in urgent whispers that carried an undertone of anxiety. Other flight attendants had joined them, a huddle of navy blue uniforms and increasingly worried expressions. Something in the captain's tone had conveyed that this wasn't a routine mechanical check or a simple logistics issue. This was something else. Something serious enough to override all normal procedures. The plane turned around, a slow cumbersome maneuver that seemed to take forever. Passengers complained loudly. The businessman in 4D was on his phone immediately, calling his assistant to reschedule meetings. Others were checking airline apps, looking for alternative flights, calculating delays and missed connections. The elderly couple in row 3 simply held hands and waited with the patience of people who had learned that sometimes travel didn't go according to plan. When the aircraft finally reached the gate and the jetway reconnected with a muted thud, the cabin door opened to reveal not the usual gate agent but a group of airline supervisors. 3 of them, all wearing suits rather than standard uniforms, all with expressions of extreme seriousness. They boarded efficiently and moved directly to where Jennifer and Brian stood frozen near the galley. The lead supervisor, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, spoke in a low voice that nonetheless carried through the silent cabin. Every passenger was straining to hear, sensing that something unprecedented was happening. Jennifer Martinez and Brian Cooper, you need to come with us immediately. Gather your personal belongings. Jennifer's face went pale. What? Why? What's going on? Not here. Come with us now. The supervisor's tone left no room for negotiation. Another supervisor, a man with dark hair graying at the temples, pulled out his tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be passenger manifests and incident reports. Brian tried to maintain his authoritative demeanor. I don't understand. We handled a situation according to company policy. A passenger was removed due to ticketing irregularities and disruptive behavior. Everything was by the book. That's not what happened, and you know it. The third supervisor, younger but no less serious, spoke quietly. Now you can come voluntarily or we can make this significantly more uncomfortable for everyone involved. Your choice. Something in their expressions must have communicated the gravity of the situation, because both Jennifer and Brian moved to comply, gathering their items with shaking hands. Jennifer's eyes were filling with tears. Brian kept opening his mouth as if to protest, then closing it again when no adequate words came. The other flight attendants watched in shocked silence, clearly understanding that they were witnessing something catastrophic to their colleagues' careers. As the crew members were escorted toward the front of the plane, the woman in 2B leaned into the aisle, trying to catch someone's attention. Excuse me, what about the rest of us? Are we going to depart soon? We've been sitting here for over an hour now. Her voice had taken on a shrill quality, frustration overriding any sense of reading the room. The lead supervisor turned to address the cabin, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. There's been a serious incident involving passenger treatment on this aircraft. The relevant crew members are being removed from duty pending investigation. We will update you on departure status shortly. In the meantime, all passengers need to remain in their seats. What kind of incident? Someone called from economy, their voice carrying up to first class. It involves the passenger who was removed from this flight approximately 40 minutes ago. The supervisor's eyes swept the first-class cabin, landing specifically on the woman in 2B. A 12-year-old child who was racially profiled and illegally removed from her assigned seat. A collective intake of breath rippled through the cabin. Several passengers who had been recording earlier suddenly became very interested in their laps, trying to make their phones less visible. The woman in 2B's face went through a rapid series of expressions, from confusion to understanding to something approaching horror. Now wait just a minute, she started, her voice climbing an octave. I simply expressed concern about a ticketing issue. I didn't racially profile anyone. I paid good money for this seat and I have a right to comfortable travel conditions. The gray-haired supervisor's expression could have frozen lava. Ma'am, we have your statements recorded. We have witness accounts from other passengers. We have security footage from the gate area. And we have multiple videos that passengers took of the incident, several of which have already been posted online and are currently going viral. So I would suggest you stop talking. The woman's mouth snapped shut. Her husband had gone very still, his face pale. Around them, other passengers were pulling out phones, not to record this time but to search social media, to see what was being said, to understand exactly what they had been part of. The businessman in 4D was scrolling rapidly, his expression growing increasingly alarmed. The elderly woman in 3B had tears running down her face, whispering, I should have said something, over and over to her husband. The supervisor continued, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. We're going to need some of you to provide statements. Particularly anyone who witnessed the initial complaint or the removal. And ma'am, she looked directly at the woman in 2B, you'll need to gather your belongings as well. You're being removed from this flight. What? You can't do that. I'm a passenger. I didn't break any rules. You initiated a discriminatory complaint against a minor child and created a hostile environment. That violates our passenger conduct policy. You and your husband are both being removed and placed on our restricted passenger list pending review. The husband finally found his voice. This is insane. We were just trying to ensure proper ticketing procedures. If there was an error in how the situation was handled, that's on your staff, not on us. Your wife specifically stated that the child didn't belong in first class. That she should be in economy where she'd be more comfortable. Those are your exact words, ma'am, and they're on multiple recordings. There was no ticketing error. There was only your assumption that a black child couldn't possibly have a legitimate right to sit in premium seating. The supervisor gestured toward the door. Security is waiting to escort you out. The woman opened her mouth to protest further, but her husband grabbed her arm and shook his head. They gathered their belongings in humiliated silence and walked up the aisle under the stares of every passenger on the plane. Several people were openly recording now, phones pointed at the couple's walk of shame. Unlike when the girl had been removed, no one applauded. Once they were gone, the lead supervisor turned back to address the remaining passengers. For those of you who participated in this incident, either through active complaints or through recording the child's humiliation without intervening, I suggest you think very carefully about your actions. This airline takes discrimination seriously, and there will be consequences. She paused, letting that sink in. The CEO of our parent company will be arriving shortly to personally address this situation. Those of you who were directly involved can expect to be contacted. A voice from the back of first class, shaky and uncertain, asked the question everyone was suddenly thinking. Who exactly is the CEO? The supervisor's expression suggested they were all about to find out just how badly they had miscalculated. The child you removed from this aircraft is his daughter. The cabin erupted in frantic whispers. Phones came out en masse as passengers began frantically searching for information. The businessman in 4D went completely white as something on his screen confirmed his worst fears. Other passengers were deleting videos from their phones, as if that would somehow erase their complicity. But digital footprints were permanent, and they were all about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. The executive terminal at Denver International Airport existed in a different realm than the regular gates where normal travelers passed through. It was quieter, more luxurious, designed for corporate jets and private aircraft carrying people for whom standard procedures were gentle suggestions rather than absolute rules. When the sleek Gulfstream touched down on the designated runway at exactly 2:15, airport personnel were already in position, ready to facilitate the kind of arrival that happened maybe 3 or 4 times a month at most. The man who emerged from the aircraft looked like power personified. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall with the build of someone who made time for fitness despite an undoubtedly demanding schedule. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind that cost more than many people's monthly salaries. But it was his face that truly captured attention. Strong features, dark skin, and eyes that at the moment were absolutely cold with controlled fury. This was a man who had built an empire, who made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of customers. This was a man who was about to demonstrate exactly what happened when someone hurt his child. He was flanked by 4 others. 2 were clearly lawyers, carrying leather briefcases and wearing expressions of professional determination. The other 2 were corporate security, former law enforcement or military by their bearing, present to ensure nothing interfered with what was about to happen. They moved through the executive terminal like a force of nature, airport staff stepping aside automatically, recognizing that this was not someone to delay or obstruct. Officer Morrison was waiting near the executive lounge entrance, the girl standing beside him. The moment she saw her father, her carefully maintained composure shattered. She ran to him, and he caught her in an embrace that was both gentle and fierce. For a long moment, he simply held her, one hand on the back of her head, the other wrapped around her shoulders. When he finally pulled back to look at her face, seeing the tear tracks and red eyes and the remnants of trauma in her expression, something in his own face shifted. The cold fury became something even more dangerous. Focused determination. "I'm so sorry, baby," he said quietly, cupping her face in his hands. "This should never have happened. Never. But I promise you, we're going to make this right. Are you okay? Did anyone hurt you? Did they touch you?" The questions came rapid fire, parental concern overriding everything else temporarily. "I'm okay, Dad. I'm glad you're here." Her voice was small, tired, the voice of a child who had been forced to be too brave for too long. He hugged her again, then turned his attention to Officer Morrison, who had been standing at a respectful distance. "You're Morrison. The one who stayed with my daughter?" The officer nodded, suddenly looking uncertain. The man extended his hand. "Thank you. Genuinely. For showing her basic human decency when others failed to do so. I won't forget that." Morrison shook his hand, looking relieved. "Sir, I just did what was right. What should have been done from the start. And yet you were the only one who did it. That matters." He turned to his legal team. "Make a note. Officer Morrison provided appropriate care and respect. He's excluded from any actions we take." One of the lawyers made a notation on her tablet. The airport's operations manager appeared, a harried-looking man in his early 50s, clearly stressed by having to manage a situation that had escalated far beyond normal procedures. "Mr. Harrison, sir, we've prepared conference room A for your use. Everyone you requested has been assembled. I want to assure you that we take this matter extremely seriously and we're cooperating fully with whatever you need. Alexander Harrison." The name that should have been recognized immediately by anyone working for the airline or its parent company. The name that was on buildings and charitable foundations and quarterly reports. The man who had started as a software engineer and built a technology empire before diversifying into transportation, real estate, media. The man who owned 43% of the parent company that operated the airline that had just humiliated his daughter. The man who could, with a few phone calls and signature, reshape entire corporate structures. "I appreciate your cooperation," Harrison said, his tone making clear this wasn't really optional. "Let's proceed." He kept one arm around his daughter's shoulders as they walked through the terminal, his legal team and security flanking them. They made an impressive procession, one that turned heads and generated urgent phone calls from airport staff warning their supervisors that something major was unfolding. Conference Room A was exactly what one would expect for executive meetings. Large mahogany table, leather chairs, sophisticated video conferencing equipment, walls that were probably soundproofed. When Harrison's group entered, they found it already occupied. Jennifer and Brian sat on one side of the table, looking like defendants at a trial. The woman from seat 2B and her husband occupied chairs near them, the woman's earlier confidence completely evaporated. Several airline supervisors and the airport's legal counsel filled the remaining seats. Everyone stood when Harrison entered, then sat back down at his gesture. Harrison guided his daughter to a chair directly beside where he would sit at the head of the table. He wanted her visible, wanted everyone in this room to constantly see the child they had harmed. One of his lawyers placed a tablet on the table in front of him and began queuing up files. The other lawyer sat on his opposite side, legal pad at ready. "Let's establish the facts," Harrison began without preamble, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "My name is Alexander Harrison. I am the CEO of Harrison Technologies and the majority shareholder of Trans-American Holdings, which owns this airline among other transportation companies. The young woman sitting beside me is my daughter, Gabrielle Harrison. This morning, she was removed from Flight 447 to Los Angeles despite having a valid first-class ticket that I personally purchased for her. She was questioned, accused of being in the wrong section, publicly humiliated in front of dozens of passengers, and ultimately escorted off the aircraft by security. Would anyone like to dispute these basic facts?" Silence. Jennifer was crying silently, tears streaming down her face but making no sound. Brian looked like he might be sick. The woman from 2B seemed to be trying to make herself smaller, shrinking into her chair. "Good. Now let's review exactly what happened." Harrison nodded to his lawyer, who began playing audio recordings. They had somehow obtained the black box backup recordings from the aircraft's internal systems, the ones that captured every conversation in case of emergencies or investigations. Every word spoken to Gabrielle, every skeptical question, every dismissive comment. Jennifer asking if she was sure she was in the right section. Brian suggesting she'd be more comfortable in economy. The way they had demanded her father's contact information. All of it played back in damning clarity. Then came the passenger videos. Multiple angles of Gabrielle being questioned, of her crying, of her gathering her belongings and walking past rows of silent passengers. The elderly woman's applause captured from 3 different phones. The woman from 2B's voice clear as crystal, "I paid $1,500 for this seat. I shouldn't have to sit next to someone who clearly doesn't belong here." When the recordings ended, Harrison let the silence sit for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice somehow even colder than before. "My daughter is 12 years old. She had a completely valid first-class ticket. She was polite, quiet, and caused no disturbance whatsoever. The only reason she was targeted was because of the color of her skin. Every single person in this room knows that's true. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." Brian tried to speak. "Mr. Harrison, sir, we were just following protocol for unaccompanied minors. We needed to verify." "Stop." Harrison's single word cut through the attempted explanation like a blade. You didn't question any other unaccompanied minors on that flight. There were two. Both white. Both in economy. Neither was asked for additional verification. Neither was threatened with removal. You singled out my daughter because she was a black child in first class and you couldn't reconcile that with your narrow worldview. We didn't mean, it wasn't about race, Jennifer managed through her tears. Then what was it about? Harrison's question hung in the air, unanswerable because any honest answer would confirm exactly what he had said. I'll tell you what happens now. You two are terminated, effective immediately. Your employment with this airline and any subsidiary of Trans-American Holdings is permanently ended. You will be placed on an industry-wide restricted list, which means no major airline will hire you for customer-facing positions. I'm also pursuing civil rights violations, which means federal investigations and potential criminal charges depending on what they find. Both crew members looked devastated, but Harrison wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the couple from seat 2B. As for you. You initiated this situation. You complained about a child sitting near you based solely on racial prejudice. Don't bother denying it. We have your exact words recorded multiple times. You're banned from this airline and every airline in the Trans-American network. That's 17 carriers across 4 continents. You're also being added to our industry sharing list, which means most major airlines globally will decline your business. The woman found her voice, shrill with panic. You can't do this. We have rights. We're customers. You were customers. Now you're liabilities. And yes, I absolutely can do this. Read your ticket agreement. Airlines reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who creates hostile environments or engages in discriminatory behavior. You did both. Harrison's voice remained level, factual, making it clear this wasn't anger speaking but calculated consequence. Her husband tried a different approach. Mr. Harrison, please. We made a mistake. We're sorry. This will ruin us. My wife didn't understand the full situation. If we had known who your daughter was. Stop right there. Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to something even more dangerous than before. If you had known who she was. Not if you had known she was a human being deserving of respect. Not if you had known she had every right to be in that seat. If you had known she was my daughter. Do you understand how that proves exactly what the problem is? My daughter shouldn't need my name or my wealth to be treated with basic human dignity. Every child, regardless of their family's status or their skin color, deserves to fly without being harassed and humiliated. He stood up, towering over the table. Now you all have a choice. You can accept these consequences, sign the agreements my lawyers will present acknowledging your actions and waiving any claims against the airline or Trans-American Holdings. In exchange, I'll limit my public statements and keep the lawsuits civil rather than pursuing criminal charges where applicable. Or you can refuse, and I'll dedicate substantial resources to making your lives as difficult as you made my daughter's mourning. I have excellent lawyers and unlimited funds and plenty of motivation. What's it going to be? One by one, broken and defeated, they agreed. Documents were signed. Statements were made. The woman from 2B was sobbing openly now, the reality of consequences finally penetrating. Brian looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. Jennifer couldn't even look at Gabrielle, shame and regret written across every feature. Only when it was all finished did Harrison's expression soften slightly. He looked at his daughter, who had sat silently through the entire proceeding, watching the people who had hurt her face justice. How are you doing, sweetheart? I'm okay, Dad. She looked at the people across the table, then back at her father. Can we go home now? We can go anywhere you want. He helped her to her feet, keeping his arm around her shoulders. As they walked toward the door, he paused and turned back. One more thing. This incident will be used as a case study in every diversity and sensitivity training program across all trans-American companies. Your names will be redacted, but your actions won't be. Every employee will learn exactly what not to do and exactly what happens when they fail to treat passengers with dignity. Maybe that will prevent the next child from experiencing what my daughter went through today. They left the conference room, leaving behind people whose lives had been irrevocably changed by their choices that morning. Sometimes consequences came slowly. Sometimes they came like a tidal wave. Today was definitely the latter. By the time Alexander and Gabrielle Harrison reached the executive lounge to wait for their rescheduled departure on one of his private aircraft, the story had already exploded across social media. What had started as passenger videos posted with outraged captions had become a full-scale viral phenomenon, the kind that dominated news cycles and trending topics and sparked national conversations. One of Harrison's PR team members, a sharp woman named Patricia who had worked with him for 8 years, met them in the lounge with her tablet already pulled up to show the metrics. "We're at 12 million views across all platforms in just under 2 hours, she reported efficiently. The hashtag Black in First Class is #1 trending worldwide. We're getting support from civil rights organizations, celebrities, politicians. The airline stock is down 4% and dropping." Harrison took the tablet, scrolling through the posts. Some were the original passenger videos, now shared thousands of times. Others were commentary, think pieces being written in real time, parents sharing their own children's experiences with discrimination. The story had touched a nerve, tapped into something that went far beyond one incident on one flight. This was about every black parent who worried when their child traveled alone. Every black professional who had been questioned about whether they really belonged in business class. Every instance of casual racism that got dismissed as misunderstanding or policy. "Have we released our statement?" he asked Patricia. "Posted 15 minutes ago across all platforms. It's being widely shared. Very positive reception." She swiped to show him the official statement from Harrison Technologies and Trans-American Holdings. It was clear, direct, and pulled no punches. It acknowledged what had happened to Gabrielle, announced the termination of the employees involved, detailed the immediate policy changes being implemented, and committed to systematic reform across all company operations. The statement ended with words Harrison had written himself: "My daughter should never have had to prove her right to exist in space she had legitimately paid for. No child should. We are committed to ensuring this never happens again, not just within our companies but industry-wide. Discrimination has no place in air travel or anywhere else in society." Within an hour, other passengers from Flight 447 had started posting their own videos and statements. Several expressed shame for not intervening, for recording the incident but not speaking up. A few tried to defend their silence by saying they didn't understand the full situation. Those posts were met with harsh criticism in the comments. Silence in the face of injustice, people pointed out, was its own form of complicity. The black security officer, Morrison, gave a statement to local news that was both professional and pointed. He described responding to the call, reviewing the girl's valid documentation, recognizing the situation for what it was, and feeling frustrated when his assessment was overridden. "That child did everything right," he said directly to the camera. "She was polite, she had proper documentation, she wasn't causing any disturbance. She was removed for one reason only, and we all know what that reason was." His statement went viral too, shared approvingly by people who appreciated that he had spoken truth clearly without hedging or euphemism. Within 2 days, Harrison personally reached out to him with a job offer, a significant promotion to head of diversity and inclusion initiatives for all trans-American security operations. Morrison accepted. Jennifer and Brian's attempted apologies, posted to their personal social media accounts, were met with brutal unsympathy. Comment sections filled with variations of, "You humiliated a child," and, "You deserve what you got," and, "Cry me a river." Several people tracked down where they had worked previously, found other complaints about their behavior, created threads documenting patterns of bias. The internet was unforgiving, and it had collectively decided these people deserved no mercy. The woman from seat 2B made the mistake of trying to defend herself online. She posted a long screed about cancel culture and how she'd just been expressing legitimate concerns and how her life was being destroyed over a misunderstanding. Her employer, a mid-size marketing firm in Dallas, saw the post and the thousands of angry responses it generated. They released a statement within 6 hours announcing she had been let go, emphasizing that her views did not represent their company values. Her husband tried to keep his head down, but his name was connected to hers, and professional relationships quietly cooled as colleagues distanced themselves from association. News outlets picked up the story, running segments during prime time that featured footage of Gabrielle being removed, interviews with civil rights attorneys discussing racial profiling, and debates about airline policies and passenger conduct. Some conservative commentators tried to frame it as political correctness gone too far, suggesting Harrison was using his wealth to bully people over an honest mistake. Those takes were widely criticized, even by other conservatives who acknowledged that what had happened to the girl was indefensible regardless of political affiliation. Civil rights organizations praised Harrison's response as a model for how corporations with genuine power should react to discrimination. The NAACP issued a statement commending the swift action and calling for other companies to implement similar accountability measures. Several other major corporations announced they would review their own anti-discrimination policies and training programs, not wanting to be the next viral story about failing to protect minority customers. 3 days after the incident, the Department of Transportation announced it was launching a formal investigation into patterns of discrimination in airline passenger treatment. They specifically cited Gabrielle's case as the catalyst but noted they had been receiving complaints for years. The investigation would examine booking data, removal statistics, complaint records, and conduct interviews with passengers who reported being profiled. It was the kind of systematic scrutiny the industry had long avoided, now impossible to ignore given the public attention. Gabrielle herself became a reluctant symbol. She hadn't asked for the attention, hadn't wanted to be the face of anything. She just wanted to visit her father without being humiliated. But the story had taken on a life of its own, and she found herself thrust into a role she never sought. Her father shielded her from most of the media requests, declining interviews on her behalf, protecting her space to process what had happened. When she returned to school the following week, she wasn't sure what to expect. Her story had been everywhere. Everyone knew what had happened. She worried about being treated differently, about becoming that girl who was in the news. But her classmates surprised her. Several came up to share their own experiences with discrimination, smaller incidents that they'd never reported, moments when they'd been made to feel like they didn't belong. Gabrielle realized that by speaking her truth, she had created space for others to acknowledge theirs. A month later, she was invited to speak at a youth empowerment conference in Chicago. Initially she declined, feeling too nervous about public speaking and not sure what she could possibly say that would matter. But her father encouraged her gently, reminding her that her experience, as painful as it was, had already sparked real change. Maybe there was value in putting words to it, in helping other young people understand they weren't alone. Her speech was 6 minutes long. She spoke honestly about the fear she felt when she realized something was wrong, about the confusion of doing everything right but still being punished, about the humiliation of walking past all those people who just watched. But she also spoke about what came after. About her father's response. About the changes that had been implemented. About the other young people who had reached out to share their stories. "I didn't ask to be a symbol," she said near the end of her speech, her voice steady and clear. "I just wanted to visit my dad. I just wanted to fly in the seat he bought for me without being questioned and doubted and removed. But if my tears that day can prevent another child's tears tomorrow, then maybe it meant something. Maybe the worst day I'd had in my life can help make things a little bit better for someone else." The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Video of the speech was shared millions of times, picked up by news outlets, featured in think pieces about youth activism and corporate accountability. Gabrielle Harrison became a name associated not just with victimization but with dignified resistance, with the kind of strength that comes from refusing to accept injustice as normal. 6 months after the incident, the effects continued to ripple outward in ways both large and small. Trans-American Holdings had completely overhauled its diversity and inclusion programs, implementing mandatory quarterly training for all customer-facing employees. The training wasn't the usual superficial module that people clicked through without paying attention. It was intensive, uncomfortable, designed to force people to confront their own biases and assumptions. It used Gabrielle's case as the primary example, walking through every decision point where things could have gone differently, examining why they didn't. Other airlines had taken notice. Nobody wanted to be the next viral discrimination story. Several major carriers announced their own policy revisions, creating easier reporting mechanisms for passengers who experienced bias, establishing third-party oversight committees to review complaints, and most significantly, changing how they approached passenger disputes. The default was no longer to assume the complaining passenger was right. The default was to examine the actual evidence before taking action that could humiliate or harm someone. Harrison himself had established the Gabrielle Harrison Scholarship Fund with a $5 million endowment. It provided financial support to students from underrepresented backgrounds who had faced discrimination in educational or professional settings. The application required an essay about the experience of bias and how the applicant had responded or planned to respond. Within the first month, they received over 3,000 applications, each one a story of injustice that deserved attention. Reading through those applications was painful for Harrison. So many young people carrying burdens they shouldn't have to carry, facing obstacles that existed for no reason other than prejudice and narrow-mindedness. He expanded the fund, adding another $3 million and broadening the criteria. If he couldn't fix the world's problems, he could at least help some young people overcome the unfair barriers they faced. Gabrielle's relationship with her father had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. They had always been close despite his demanding work schedule and her living primarily with her mother in Denver. But the incident had highlighted for him just how vulnerable she was when he wasn't there to protect her, and how much she shouldn't have to depend on his protection for basic respect. He started taking more time off, blocking out days on his calendar that were sacred family time, prioritizing presence over productivity. She understood him better now too. Understood the weight he carried being one of the most prominent black CEOs in the country. Understood that his success was both power and responsibility, that he was expected to be a voice for communities and causes, that his actions were scrutinized in ways his white counterparts weren't. She saw how tired he got sometimes, how the constant expectation to be perfect and unimpeachable wore on him. But she also saw his determination never to back down, never to accept less than what was right. They established a tradition, just the two of them. Every month, on the anniversary date of the incident, they flew together somewhere. Sometimes it was necessary business travel. Sometimes it was just for fun, quick trips to cities they wanted to explore. They always flew first class. They always sat together. And they always walked onto the plane with their heads held high, claiming space that was rightfully theirs. The first time they did this, Gabrielle was nervous. Memories of that day were still fresh, still painful. When they boarded and she saw the first-class cabin and those leather seats, her chest tightened with anxiety. But her father kept his hand on her shoulder, grounding her, reminding her through touch that she was safe. The flight attendants were exceptionally polite, almost deferential, whether because they recognized the name Harrison or because word had spread about what kind of response discrimination would receive. By the third month, by the third flight together, it got easier. The anxiety faded. The memories still existed but they had less power. She could sit in first class without feeling like she had to prove she belonged there. She could exist in that space as herself, a child taking a trip with her father, nothing more complicated than that. As for the people directly involved in the original incident, their paths diverged in the months that followed. Jennifer struggled significantly. The airline industry blacklist was real and thorough. She applied for numerous jobs, in customer service, in hospitality, in any field where her experience might transfer. But a simple background check brought up the incident, and employers quietly moved on to other candidates. She ended up working retail at a local mall, a job that paid barely enough to cover her rent, a stark decline from her airline's salary and benefits. After 4 months, she wrote a letter directly to Gabrielle and her father. Not a public apology, not an attempt to rehabilitate her image, but a private acknowledgement of harm caused. She took full responsibility, explained that she had been examining her own biases and prejudices, that she was in therapy trying to understand how she had let assumptions override decency. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for the blacklist to be lifted. She simply wanted them to know that she understood what she had done and was trying to become a better person. Harrison showed the letter to Gabrielle and asked her what she wanted to do. After thinking about it for several days, Gabrielle wrote back. Her letter was brief but not unkind. She acknowledged Jennifer's apology, said she hoped the growth was genuine, but made clear that consequences were appropriate and necessary. Some things couldn't be undone. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. She wished Jennifer well in her personal development but didn't offer absolution. It wasn't her job to make the woman feel better about her own actions. Brian never apologized. He blamed the incident on Jennifer, on airline policy, on society being too sensitive, on everything except his own choices. He hired a lawyer and tried to sue for wrongful termination. The case was dismissed quickly. Not only did the evidence overwhelmingly support Trans-American's decision, but his employment contract explicitly included provisions about discrimination and passenger treatment. He had violated his contract. The termination was legally bulletproof. His lawyer advised him to drop it and move on. He refused to accept defeat and kept pushing, burning through money on legal fees until he finally gave up a year later. Last anyone heard, he was working security at a shopping center, bitter and unrepentant. The couple from Seat 2B essentially disappeared from public life. They moved to a smaller city in another state, changed some of their social media presence, tried to start over. But the internet is forever, and their names remained attached to the incident in search results. The woman attempted a public redemption tour 6 months later, writing a piece for a minor online publication about learning from mistakes and growing from adversity. It was met with skepticism and criticism. Real growth, people pointed out, didn't require a publicity campaign. It happened quietly, in private, through changed behavior rather than public declarations. As time passed, the incident itself became a landmark case in discussions about corporate discrimination and accountability. It was cited in business school classes, in legal seminars, in diversity training programs across multiple industries. What happened to Gabrielle Harrison became shorthand for the kind of casual racism that pervaded customer service interactions, and the response her father implemented became a model for swift, decisive action against bias. The airport where everything had occurred installed a small plaque in the terminal, not specifically about Gabrielle's case but dedicated more broadly to equal treatment and respect for all travelers. It was unveiled at a small ceremony that Harrison and Gabrielle attended. She stood there looking at the plaque, thinking about that awful morning, about how much had changed because of one terrible day, and felt something complex and difficult to name. Not quite satisfaction, not quite closure. Maybe simply acknowledgement that pain could sometimes transform into purpose. 2 years and 3 months after the incident, Gabrielle Harrison stood at a podium in a hotel ballroom in Atlanta, looking out at an audience of 300 airline industry executives, pilots, flight attendants, and corporate leaders. She was 14 now, taller, more confident in her bearing, but still carrying traces of the girl who had been humiliated on Flight 447. Her father sat in the front row, watching her with obvious pride mixed with protectiveness. He had learned to let her step forward into these moments while remaining close enough to support her if needed. The conference was her father's initiative, an annual gathering focused on equity and inclusion in transportation industries. This was the second year, and it had grown significantly since the inaugural event. These people had paid substantial registration fees to attend, to learn, to hopefully change their practices and perspectives. Gabrielle was the keynote speaker for the closing session, a role she had accepted with nervousness but also determination. 2 years ago, she began, her voice steady through the microphone, I was removed from an airplane for the crime of sitting in a seat I had every right to occupy. I was 12 years old. I was polite. I had valid documentation. I wasn't causing any problems. But I was black, and I was in first class, and apparently those two facts together were suspicious enough to warrant public humiliation and removal. The room was completely silent. Some people looked uncomfortable. Good. They should be uncomfortable. I want to tell you what that experience felt like, because I think sometimes when we talk about discrimination in abstract terms, we forget the human impact. I was scared. Not just embarrassed or upset. Actually scared. Because I didn't understand what I had done wrong. I kept thinking, what rule did I break? Why are these adults angry at me? Why won't anyone help me? She paused, letting that sink in. I thought maybe I was crazy. Maybe I was missing something obvious. Maybe everyone else could see something wrong with me that I couldn't see in myself. Several people in the audience were crying silently. A flight attendant in the third row, a young black woman, had tears streaming down her face. The woman sitting next to me said I didn't belong there. She said she had paid good money for her seat and shouldn't have to sit next to someone like me. The flight attendants demanded to verify my ticket over and over, as if it might suddenly reveal itself to be fake. Other passengers watched and recorded and did nothing. One woman actually applauded when I was forced to leave. Gabrielle's voice remained level, factual, but the words themselves carried weight. That day, I learned that I could do everything right and still be treated like I was wrong. I learned that my dignity was conditional, dependent on whether adults around me decided I deserved it. She moved slightly away from the podium, wanting to be less formal, more direct. But I also learned something else. I learned that consequences matter. That accountability matters. When my father found out what happened, he didn't just comfort me and move on. He demanded justice. Not revenge. Justice. There's a difference. Gabrielle described the aftermath, the firings, the policy changes, the national conversation. She talked about the scholarship fund and the young people it had helped. She mentioned the other passengers who had reached out to share their own stories, creating a network of witnesses to everyday injustice who were now speaking up instead of staying silent. Some people said my father overreacted. That he used his wealth and power to bully people over an honest mistake. She shook her head firmly. But it wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are accidental. What happened to me was a choice. Multiple choices, made by multiple people, all rooted in the same assumption about who I was based on how I looked. Then came the reveal that made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. There are 3 executives in this room right now who were on that flight. You were in first class. You watched everything happen. You had phones in your hands and power in your positions and you did nothing. You stayed silent while a child was humiliated and removed. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. People glanced around, trying to identify who she meant. Gabrielle didn't point them out. She didn't need to. They knew who they were. I don't know if you regret your silence. I don't know if you learned anything from watching what happened next. But I hope you did. Because here's what I've learned in the past 2 years, injustice only succeeds when good people choose comfort over courage. When people who know better decide that speaking up is too risky, too awkward, too likely to make them uncomfortable. Discrimination thrives in that silence. She paused for water, gathering herself for what came next. But I also learned about integrity. About people like Officer Morrison, the security officer who treated me with respect when others didn't. Who stood up for me even though it would have been easier not to. My father hired him 2 years ago to head our diversity and inclusion initiatives, and he's done incredible work. He's here today. Morrison, sitting in the second row, stood and nodded to acknowledge the recognition. The room erupted in applause. He had become something of a legend in the industry, the officer who had done the right thing and been rewarded for it, proof that integrity wasn't just its own reward but could lead to tangible advancement. The people who did the right thing when it was hard, they're the ones who should be leading, Gabrielle continued. They're the ones who understand that policies and procedures are only as good as the humans implementing them. That training only matters if people actually change their behavior. That statements of values are meaningless unless they're backed up by action. She then unveiled the new initiative she and her father had been developing, a youth passenger bill of rights, drafted in consultation with civil rights attorneys, child advocacy groups, and young people who had experienced discrimination while traveling. It outlined specific protections for minor travelers, clear standards for when additional verification was appropriate, and streamlined complaint processes. Several major airlines had already committed to adopting it. The document was projected on screens around the ballroom as Gabrielle walked through key provisions. This didn't exist before because no one thought it was necessary. But I think we've proven it is. Young people deserve to travel with dignity. They deserve to move through the world without constantly having to prove they belong in whatever space they occupy. As she concluded her formal remarks, Alexander Harrison stepped up to the podium beside his daughter. The room stood in ovation, recognizing both of them. When the applause finally faded and people sat back down, Harrison took the microphone. My daughter just taught this room, and honestly has taught me over the past 2 years, what real strength looks like. I thought my wealth and power could protect her. I thought if I gave her the best of everything, booked her in first class, made sure she had every advantage, that would be enough. It wasn't. His voice was thick with emotion, less composed than his usual corporate addresses. What protects her, what protects all our children, isn't money or status. It's a society that values every person equally. It's adults who choose courage over comfort. It's systems that actually work the way they're supposed to instead of reinforcing bias. He looked at his daughter with obvious love and respect. Money can demand accountability, and I'll continue to use mine that way. But only humanity creates real change. Only people deciding to be better, to do better, can transform culture. That's what we're asking of everyone in this room. Not perfection. Just genuine effort to see people, all people, as deserving of dignity and respect. The conference ended shortly after, but the conversations continued in clusters throughout the ballroom. People approached Gabrielle to thank her, to share their own stories, to commit to doing better. Some admitted their own past failures. Others asked how they could contribute to the Youth Bill of Rights implementation. The energy in the room had shifted from passive reception to active engagement. That evening, Alexander and Gabrielle boarded a commercial flight back to Denver. First class, naturally. The flight attendant who greeted them, a young black woman about 25, smiled warmly. Welcome aboard, Mr. and Ms. Harrison. It's genuinely an honor to serve you today. Her name tag read, Monica. There was recognition in her eyes, but also something else. Gratitude, maybe. Or solidarity. Thank you, Monica, Gabrielle said, returning the smile genuinely. We're happy to be here. No anxiety this time. No tension in her shoulders. Just a girl traveling with her father. They settled into seats 2A and 2B, the same row numbers that had marked the beginning of this journey 2 years earlier. Gabrielle pulled out a thick textbook, pre-law coursework she was doing through an advanced studies program. She had decided she wanted to pursue aviation law, wanted to continue the work that had started on that awful morning. Her father smiled when he saw the book, proud but not surprised. She had found purpose in pain, had transformed trauma into determination. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Gabrielle looked out the window at the lights of the airport falling away behind them. Somewhere down there, other travelers were boarding other planes, carrying their own stories and challenges and hopes. She couldn't fix everything that was broken in the world. She couldn't eliminate prejudice or guarantee that no other child would face what she had faced. But she could tell her story. She could demand accountability. She could work toward systems that functioned more justly. That had to be enough. That had to matter. The plane lifted into the evening sky, climbing through clouds toward stars just becoming visible. Alexander reached over and squeezed his daughter's hand. No words necessary. Just a father and daughter, flying together, claiming space that had always been rightfully theirs but had been denied until they refused to accept denial. Just two people moving through the world with dignity intact and purpose defined. Just as it should always have been. Just as it would be for others, because of their courage to demand better. The fight wasn't over. It never really was. But tonight, 30,000 feet above the ground, there was peace. There was family. There was the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had fought for what was right and would continue fighting for as long as necessary. The screen fades on the sunset outside the window, golden light painting the clouds, the plane carrying them toward home. So what do you think about Gabrielle's journey from victim to advocate? Does her story inspire you to speak up when you witness injustice? Comment below and tell me about a time you chose courage over comfort, or a time you wish you had. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel because we share real stories about real people fighting for dignity and justice every single week. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong, someone who needs reminding that their voice matters and their dignity is non-negotiable. Thank you for watching, for listening, for caring about what happened to Gabrielle. May we all find the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's risky, even when we could just stay silent and make our lives easier. Because that's how the world changes. One person, one moment, one choice at a time. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight. This story reveals profound truths about dignity, accountability, and systemic change. First, discrimination thrives in silence. When good people witness injustice but choose comfort over courage, they become complicit in the harm being done. Every passenger who recorded Gabrielle's humiliation without intervening bears responsibility for her trauma. Second, consequences matter immensely. Swift, decisive accountability sends a message that bias will not be tolerated, creating real deterrence against future discrimination. Third, power carries responsibility. Alexander Harrison could have simply gotten his daughter another flight, but he chose to demand systemic change that would protect all children, not just his own. Fourth, trauma can transform into purpose when channeled constructively. Gabrielle's pain became advocacy that created tangible protections for other young travelers. Fifth, children deserve to move through the world with dignity intact, regardless of their family's wealth or status. Basic human respect should never be conditional on who your parents are. Finally, institutional change requires both individual courage and structural reform. Officer Morrison's integrity mattered, but so did the policy changes, training programs, and oversight mechanisms that followed. Real progress demands both personal accountability and systematic transformation. Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing but preventing future harm through education, awareness, and cultural shift. What would you have done if you were a passenger on that flight? Would you have spoken up for Gabrielle, or would fear of confrontation have kept you silent? Comment number 1 if you believe you would have intervened, or number 2 if you honestly think you might have stayed quiet. There's no judgment here, just honest reflection about courage and comfort. If this story challenged you to think differently about standing up against injustice, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we share powerful true stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and the lessons we can all learn from their experiences. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what everyday racism looks like, someone who's experienced discrimination themselves, or someone who has the power to create change in their workplace or community. Thank you for investing your time in Gabrielle's story, for caring about justice, and for being part of a community that believes every person deserves dignity and respect. May you always find the strength to speak truth to power, to protect the vulnerable, and to demand better from the systems and institutions around you. Until next time, remember that your voice matters, your choices have consequences, and together we can build a world where no child ever has to prove they belong. Stay strong, stay compassionate, and keep fighting for what's right.